Hi guys. Today I'll be talking about genetics and ethnicities in Crusader Kings 3 and how they work and how you can mod them. I was looking for a tutorial on how to do this online, but I couldn't find any, so I decided to make one myself after digging around in the files to figure out how it works. So this is kind of an intermediate level tutorial, I'd say. This is gonna assume that you already know how the basics of modding, like how to set up the structure of a mod and how to mod the culture, and there are plenty of tutorials about that online. Um, I'm not really an expert on modding, so if there's something you think is definitely wrong, let me know in the comments. But we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So to start out, well, what are ethnicities? So they're assigned to different cultures to give the game a range of physical characteristics for characters from a particular region in terms of facial structure, skin color, hair color, etc. So it's like why um, Irish people will have a certain range of characteristics, but those are distinguished from Arab people or North Indian people or Chinese people. And those are just a few of the different ethnicities there. A lot of the differences are not just in facial structure; it's in hairstyling and clothing, of course. Um, but an ethnicity is just how they look in their facial and body structure. So, like for example, German people, um, they're going to look physically similar to Norse people, but the clothes and the beards and all of their styling is what distinguishes them as well. So if we get into the ruler designer, when you go into change appearance, you can see most of the ethnicities listed out here. Um, Now, as of All Under Heaven, we have West African, Arabic, Asian, which is sort of a generic high-level ethnicity, and since All Under Heaven, it's been expanded into Amishiainu, Austronesian, Han Chinese, Japanese, Malay, Northeast Asian, which is like Korean, Mongolic, Tibetan. Then we have Western slash Central European, um, Northern, Northern European, so basically Norse, Arctic, which is like Finnic people, East African, uh, North Indian, South Indian, Mediterranean, Papuan, Slavic, Central Steppe Turkic, and Western Steppe Turkic. So these are all the ethnicities available in ruler design. So the ethnicity files are located here in the Crusader Kings installation folder under Game Common Ethnicities. We have a bunch of ethnicities here. Um, so we're going to start out with the 00 ethnicities templates. So this one here is the default, defines what a standard looking character is, and here in the file here it's listed as not visible, which means it won't show up in the ruler designer. If you open it up in game, it would look like this. Um, so the default is fairly European. It's actually the Western Central European doesn't change much than this, but also Northern European and Mediterranean are mostly based on it. But it creates certain standards for what a normal looking character is, and then the other ethnicities tend to build off of that. So if you look at other ethnicities, most of them use ethnicity template as their template here, which means that anything that with how the template works, anything that isn't defined in here is going to default to what is in that template defined. But then you can make another ethnicity based on that previous template. Because, for example, Asian here uses the ethnicity template. Then if we look at Han Chinese, it uses Asian as its template. Um, so anything not defined in Han Chinese will default to Asian, and then anything um, not defined in Asian will default back to the ethnicities template. So the using here defines what culture the characters will look like in Ruler Designer, um, because multiple cultures can all use the same ethnicity, but since cultures what defines um, what hairstyles look like, um, you want to, and beard styles as well for men, you want to make sure that it's generating appropriate ones. So that's why for Indian here, which is North Indian, it uses Bengali as its template. There's multiple ones that could be appropriate in terms of hairstyles, and then this ethnicity is used for multiple North Indian cultures, but that's the gist of that. So what you set here in the ethnicity file is all the genes that will be randomly generated for characters of this ethnicity. So starting out with colors, we have uh, skin color, eye color, and hair color. The way that these work is they reference the color palette range that is given for each of those colors. The game will generate a random value within these ranges. So we have our color palette here, and how this works is the skin color here. The first and third numbers refer to the minimum and maximum spots on the x-axis here, so like pink to yellow. And then the second and fourth colors refer to the minimum and maximum spots on the y-axis, so light to dark. So for example, if we're here on North Indian, we're between zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.5 and 0.5 to 0.6. So if we do randomization a couple times, you can see there's a bit of range from 0.3 to 0.5, but then it's pretty close on 0.5 to 0.6 here. So for skin color, there's usually only one range there, but for eye color and hair color, you have multiple ranges. So like brown won't exactly be the same, um, like every shade of brown, but you do have a bit of a range, and you can set how often you want characters to be blonde haired, brown haired, red haired, black haired. That's defined by these weights out front. Um, how it works is the chance of the value being chosen within this range is equal to its own weight divided by the sum of the weights. So in this case, it'd be a 4 out of 9 chance to get brown hair. Uh, so if you see here, there's a bit of a range here of brown hair that we're getting uh, within 0.65 to zero point 0.9, so about here, and then point at 0.45 to 1. So you can see a bit of a range of brown, but then there's a chance of red and then a chance of blonde. But again, not all of these are ever going to be the same. So then you list out all of the genes, and each of these genes here refers to a slider in the ruler designer. So example, start out with chin forward here, chin height, chin width, etc. And that all falls in there. Uh, and So you see for the default ethnicity, it tends to put most things towards the middle. So like you have a weight of 40 that's going to be just under the median, a weight of 40 that's going to be just above the median, and then um, you have lower chances of it being uh, more extreme in either direction. And how this works is for some of them, you have a range. The range of the slider is from 0 to 1. So if we do a couple random here, like zeros here, ones there. So if this is weighted towards uh, towards 0.45 to 0.55, most of these are gonna be in the middle right there, but then there's general lower chances of it being a bit further out. But you see here that like for chin height, the maximums are still 0.25 and 0.75. So you won't have something, it won't randomly generate characters with it that high or down that low. You know, if you've ever seen someone make an extremely grotesque or like original Oblivion tier kind of freak, now if you've ever done it yourself or you've seen someone make an extremely grotesque like original Oblivion tier freak, you can do that in CK3 if you use the extreme values. Um, but so the game tries to put a limit on that so it doesn't create those freaks by default. Now, you may have also noticed in the file here that there are these values defined by @ symbols. So you have like -1 through 3 minimum and max, and +1 through 3 minimum max. Then you have beauty and you have blend. So these define some general values that will be used commonly most often when you don't want to define them all specifically. Uh, so like if we look at gene chin forward, um, for here it'll pull in zero point 0.1 to 0.3 or -3, um, all the way up. Um, then it'll go 0.3 to 0.4, 0.4 to 0.5, then 0.5 to 0.6, 0.6 to 0.7, then 0.7 to 0.9. So those are kind of some standardized values that you'll have there. So this negative and positive, these are used for genes where the range is from 0 to 1, which is why for negative ones, it's values that are lower than 0.5 and positive is greater than 0.5. But then there are some where the range is from -1 to +1. And that's which uses the blend values here. Get 0.0 to 0.2, 0.2 to 0.5. And those are usually ones that are listed here under BS. And so you have negative and positive here. You see blend 1 is what's from 0.0 to 0.2. So you have some the ones where it's 0 to 1, you're going to want most common to be around 0.5. But then when it goes from -1 to +1, you're going to want it to be most common around 0. And then again, you don't have um, it go all the way to the maximum values, which is why, again, these start as 0.1 to 0.9, and then the blend values only go up to 0.8. They don't go all the way to 1. Then you have your beauty values here, which have different strengths depending on what level of genetic traits you have for beauty, or I think ugly works similar too. Um, and you basically set some here, and the it adjusts some of these values depending on how beautiful or ugly you are. So, for example, if we look at other traits here, and we get down to the appearance ones, you can see, well, it adds makeup too, but it like slightly adjusts her physical appearance. You can see it changes like her cheeks and her lips um, more, and then like the head, that all gets adjusted. And then, of course, you have the ugly traits. It's goes the other way, moving the whole body that way. And sometimes you can have multiple options rather than just negative and positive. Um, for example, if we look at gene BS ear bend here, we have a lower bend, upper bend, and both bend. And then this shows up in Ruler Designer as a button you can press. Here, let me take away that. But as you can see here, there's an equal chance for it to have any of these types, but for each type, it's more likely that you'll have a lower blend value. So if we go ahead and randomize this a few times, um, you can see it does randomly pick lower, upper, or both, but then you see more often it's going to be at the lower part. One particularly interesting one is eye fold shape, um, because um, for this ethnicity, it's more likely to have a positive eye fold shape, but for negative, there's two different options that are available, um, and they're less likely, but they're than positive, but they're as equal as the other. Um, but if you look at it in Ruler Designer, um, you can see here it is if it's there's only one positive, but there are two negatives. So like if you have it here in the negative, you can pick which one you want, but then once it gets in the positive, there's only one option, and this doesn't, you can't actually select that. So that one's just interesting. One particularly interesting one is eye fold shape, um, because um, for this ethnicity, it's more likely to have a positive eye fold shape, but for negative, there's two different options that are available, um, and they're less likely, but they're than positive, but they're as equal as the other. Um, but if you look at it in Ruler Designer, you can see here it is if it's there's only one positive, but there are two negatives. So like if you have it here in the negative, you can pick which one you want, but then once it gets in the positive, there's only one option, and this doesn't, you can't actually select that. So that one's just interesting. Now, an interesting gene is the bust gene. In Ruler Designer, there's only a slider here that changes the size of the bust. But if you actually look here in the genes, this is hidden in game, but there's a couple of different shapes that if one of the characters is naked, it kind of changed the way that it points. But you can't. There are random chances of getting different types, but you can't select it in Ruler Designer. Now, there's a couple of mods like the character body overhaul mod that does allow you to select it, and it gives different names for some of the different types of shapes. But for vanilla, you can't select this in Ruler Designer. But you can define it here in terms of what will be most common for each ethnicity. And then the default usually give them about the same size distribution. Like, again, most of these are equal. A couple of these are basically twice as much as some of the others. So a couple different shapes will be more likely than the others. But again, that follows the certain size distribution. The same one for all different types. And then one last interesting thing you have is the hair type gene. So in Ruler Designer or Barbershop, you can pick any hairstyle, and the hairstyles are based on the culture and different ethnicities will have different chances of certain hair types. And while the hairstyles are defined by culture, they also take into account what kind of hair you have. So there are straight, wavy, curly, afro, which refers to African textured hair, not necessarily always just an afro hairstyle. And then you have thin or straight hair with thin beard, which is more common in Asia. So like if you have two parents who are Western European and like the mom has this hairstyle, which is only available to um, characters with straight hair, and then the dad, let's say, has this bowl cut here, which is also only available to characters with straight hair. If they have a kid, the kid actually can't get any like curly hair, even if that is possible for people of your ethnicity. It's kind of random, and it will define it will pick one of the hairstyles which are valid for straight hairstyles. Now, there's a few here, like I think this is available for straight and wavy, but there's a few different hairstyles that don't share um, hair types. And then if like even if your character goes, let's say a European character goes to Africa, when they adopt African culture, they won't immediately pick one of the African hairstyles. But then like if you get married to an African character, um, there is a chance of passing down your straight hair to the child, which means even though everyone else in their culture will have one of these hairstyles, it will give an appropriate hairstyle based on the hair texture that they inherited. So now we're gonna look at the gene files itself. If you want to see how many genes are available, check out Crusader Kings 3 Game Common Genes Morph text. Um, and then you have all the morph genes in here, which correspond to the genes in the ethnicity file. And they also the ones listed as morph genes here correspond to the um, sliders that you adjust in Ruler Designer. Well, there are a couple other genes files in different some of these different files here. Um, these are classified as special genes, which define things like beards, hair, and clothes, which are more situational. So how the genes work is that each character or has a value for each gene, um, and that affects the attributes, which themselves are how that genetic value is translated to the character model. So just because a character has a genetic value, it won't always be expressed the same as the attribute because it changes based on sex and age. You have different values for men and women, boys and girls, which can be seen on the top here. So you can see um, the men basically have a range of 1, while women have a range of zero point 0.8. Um, so it means like uh, women's like features won't be expressed out as much because men and women can have the same values for genes and they'll pass these down to their children, but it's expressed differently and it tends to be expressed out more by males than by females. So at the top here, again, there are default values here, like in the gene files have how you have these add values at the top, and they can be referenced down below, but you can define a different number. such as way down here, you can define min as 0. So then you have age presets, which define how genes will be expressed differently throughout age. Um, and so that is defined here through this curve, which shows the ages. The left column is the ages divided by 100. Um, and then from on a scale of 0 to 1, how much that applies. So, for example, if we look at the primary aging preset, at age 0, it's not going to be affected. It's not going to express itself at all because it's multiplying it by 0. And then up to 25, it still won't do anything. Then from 25 to 35, it goes from 0 to 0.2. And then from 35 to 0.75, or sorry, 35 to 75 years, it, it expresses itself fully. Um, and then you have a few more. So others will apply here from 50 to 85, or from 35 to 80, 70 to 95. Um, and then you have, other multiple ones that'll apply over childhood or puberty. The most common age that most of these have is child features here. Um, so it applies only halfway from 0 to 5, and then by age 10 it applies 65%, and then by age 22 it's applied 100%. And so basically that just shows how, like, most genes down here will, gradually get applied more over age. So, as a child grows up, their features become bigger to represent, growth. Oh, and as a side note, I'm not sure if this was clear or not, but between the ages that are mentioned, it'll linearly interpolate between the two. So if you notice within here, within each of these genes, you have the gene at this level, which corresponds to the gene as defined in the ethnicity file. And then you have multiple different options here, which correspond to the different options expressed over here under the name in the ethnicities file. Most of the time, again, it is just a negative or a positive. But if we look at some where there are multiple examples, see here, you've got it defined. You got each of these options for cheek fat here. You got cheek fat 1, 2, full definition 3, 4, and you have negative. So in looking at the genes here, how it's expressed through the attributes, you have the gene, then you have the different option here. And then for each male, female, boy, girl, um, you have the attribute here, which, like I mentioned, refers to, like, I think it's like a bone or something within the actual character model that expresses how far the chin forward value should be applied. Um, then I think it takes the value given in the gene here, um, for the corresponding one, and basically it scales it to be within this minimum and maximum. Um, so again, like for male, it's negative 0.5 to 5. So if this chin forward was would say it was equal to 0.5, then they'd be square in the middle and it'd be applied to 0. But then if it was 1, The male max is 0.5, so it would be applied as a positive 0.5. Then for female, the female max is 0.4, so if it was 1, it would be applied as a positive 0.4. And then the age factor applies to that, which will multiply it depending on the age, um, showing how it increases or how it changes throughout age. So, kind of as an example for the different options, if we look at forehead brow height here, um, forehead brow height negative uh, only adjusts the forehead brow height according to what was defined in the gene, the ethnicity, and what's defined as the value for the character if it's a negative. But if it's positive, if there's another option here, um, this actually affects two attributes, and it can do that. So there's the forehead brow height attribute, um, and the again that is a kind of standard like the negative one. It applies from the male min to the male max. But there's a second attribute, the NBS forehead brow height max, and again that uses the same gene value that the character has. But this is a essentially there's like a uh, it's like a secondary bone in there affecting the character model, um, and that acts a bit differently. Rather than the minimum being standard negative zero point 0.5, the minimum is negative 1, and then it goes up to the 0.5. Um, and so how that works, this secondary attribute only comes into effect based on this curve. Um, like how earlier I talked about curves with the ages, but in this case, this applies to the value that's given here. So if it's from 0 to halfway, this secondary brow height max won't apply at all. But then from halfway to full way, then it goes into effect. So if we look at how it is in game, if we adjust the forehead brow height here, it goes down at a pretty standard rate if you have it in the negative ranges. But when you get it into the positive ranges, it kind of like moves along. But if you have this as like a standard rate, it almost looks like the like right around here, it seems to increase even faster, which means at this point is where the brow height maximum attribute kicks in, and it further brings the brow height up a bit more than it would be if it was just the opposite of this. And then if we look at genes like jaw angle or jaw height, they both add another attribute here, um, which um, like here for teeth, DS lower down. And so what that will do is it'll like adjust the teeth a bit so that if the if the mouth really starts to move, it doesn't end up with the teeth clipping through the mouth. So that's not really something that you set for your character, where you go, where in Ruler Designer there's a slider and you say, okay, I'd like my teeth to look like this. It just responds to how you set your chin to look. So then some genes don't affect the character model based on like bones or vertices, but they reflect how much a decal texture is applied to the character model. If we look, for example, at the chin cleft here, this references a decal here, which points to the path of the decal. So this one here is going to be in GFX, models, portraits, decals, male, head, um, and it has this DDS file here. Well, we have the normal and the diffuse, but so what these do is that the strength of the gene doesn't again, it doesn't adjust anything about the character model, but it changes the alpha, so the transparency of that decal that's applied. Uh, this decal here. So if we look at here, if we pull up the chin cleft, um, as it comes in here, all it's doing is it does look like the chin is being more defined, but that's not because the model is being changed at all. It doesn't have that many bones to change it, and essentially all that's happening is that this texture is slowly fading in, and that is applied along the curve here. Um, so again, like for men here, it's if it goes up to one, it's applied full strength. For a woman, if the gene is up to one, it's only applied 80% strength. Um, and then you can do other ones. You can like here you can also change like eye definition. You can add an age curve to that, and it again it works pretty similar to the blend morph genes, except it just changes the overlay rather than changing the bones itself. So other than giving an overview of how they work, how the values work, how they're defined by the ethnicity generated by the character, and then how it um, corresponds based on sex and age, I'm not really going to get into more on how the actually out of how genes express themselves. You would really only want to do that if you change how the body works, like if you do a body overhaul mod or a mod that adds non-human characters like Elder Kings or Guardians of Azeroth. And then some of those would even add new genes that fit with different attributes. So like if we look at Elder Kings here, um, you can see that they actually add different genes for elves, or the various non-human characters. But if we look at the mare, or the elves, you can see they add genes here for the forehead, um, the nose, the ears, um, things that again change the body morph. So like again, like on a regular character, I actually have as an example here. I loaded in a couple. If you have we have the take the Bosmer here, which is from Elder Kings. We've got the facial structure kind of like an elf, but right now we're missing any of the new genes that give him pointy ears or the special forehead ridges. But then if we actually pull it up here in Elder Kings, you can see here that the changes in morphs on the eyebrows and on the nose and the ears are flying, and you see it has like the custom eyes. So it looked sort of like it before, but again, if you actually modified the genes themselves, it adds a bit more. And I don't know how to do that really, but if you do and if you do want to like make it like again, if you want to make it like a sub mod for Elder Kings, or you want to do something that's compatible with character body overhaul, in that case, you just need to, like how you do with the genes morph, how each of these corresponds to one of those. You have one of these, you just need to go ahead and add this, um, add the gene name here, and then you have the options for the different ones in here. Um, and then that I think gets yes, and so that would correspond here to uh, to the different options here in game, and you would just set what you want your own custom ethnicity, how those all interact and what the chances are getting each of these types and what the value is going to be. So we're going to take a look at a few ethnicity files and how they look in game and see what we can do with them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just as an example, here's what the ethnicity template looks like in game. It's not actually defined to a culture right now, uh, but these are generally what they look like along here. So as far as facial structure, you can see that they do look pretty European, um, and most of the values here that it gives are going to be weighted to be mostly in the middle of the road here. There's a couple, as you see here, like eye wrinkles or chin definition that have a bit more of a chance of going other places. Most of it going to be towards the middle with a little bit of variety. So if we look at the Western/Central European ethnicity file here, uh, it's somewhat confusingly called Caucasian, which is just in the sense of Caucasian meaning white people. But actually, Caucasian cultures in game from the Caucasus, they'll use a Mediterranean or a Western Turkic identity or ethnicity. But so you can see here in the Caucasian ethnicity file, there's actually multiple Caucasian ethnicities that it uses. Um, so we start out with Caucasian base, which is just a copy of the ethnicity template. Uh, but it has a visible equals no, which means that you can't select it in ruler designer. So, but what is selectable here is Caucasian here, which is based on the Caucasian base. Uh, and this is what is selectable in ruler designer. So it gives the eyes a 60% chance of being blue, and it gives a bit of a range of there, and then there's a 20% chance of it each being brown or green. Then it also defines what the average hair color is going to be. Uh, so most likely to be brown with smaller chances of slightly smaller chance of black, and then smaller chances of blonde and red. So then, compared to the template, it doesn't actually change that much. It's pretty close to what's just the template ethnicity. It changes a little bit um, about the eyes and the mouth, the cheek fat, and then it defines the eyebrows, which do tend to go, since that's with hair. Um, that usually gets defined separately. Um, and then there's a northern option here, which appears in Ruler Designer too. We go and select that here. Um, but the only difference between it and the Western one is that it uses as its culture, it changes it to Swedish so that it has appropriate hairstyles and beards. But if we look at all of, look, if we just generate a bunch of these, you can see, these do look more Viking. But if you look at the general facial structure and you compare it to the West Central European, there's not actually really any substantial difference between the two. It's pulling from the same genetic pool. But then the way that these work in generating characters in game is a bit different because in the ruler designer, it's expected that the player will choose the hair color that they want. When it generates characters in game, it wants to use the same general ethnicity with similar facial features, but for different cultures, they want this distribution of hair color mostly to vary by a bit. So these are all set. So invisible to ruler designer, they define blonde, ginger, brown hair, and dark hair separate ethnicities. And these all use. Okay, well, the dark hair actually uses brown hair as its template, but brown hair uses Caucasian base as its template, as do the ginger and blonde. Um, so, and again, the Caucasian base is just a copy of the template. And for each of these, it goes ahead and defines the eye color again, same as what it did because the ruler designer one. They didn't set it in the Caucasian base for some reason, even though the chances are identical for each one. But regardless, anyway, um, it sets the chances for eye color, and then it sets the chances for hair color, but it generally only picks one color. So, well, so except the hair color here for the blonde ethnicity is always going to be blonde. Ginger's slightly a bit of an exception. It'll pick either red or auburn, which is, a type of red. Um, and then brown hair is just brown, and then dark hair is just black. And then for each of these, it defines what the eyebrows will look like. Again, because I was mentioning those, will tend to go with hair color. Um, and then it can also set the complexion. And then there's a northern copy for each of these. Since it's like, exactly the same, I don't really see why it has to be separate since none of them appear in ruler generator anyway, but they're there. So if we want to see a bit more variety between cultures that use this similar Caucasian or Western Central ethnicity, um, that's how different cultures can set in different chances of the different hair colors. So like if we look at the Irish, you can see here that brown hair is the most common, but that's just slightly more common than having ginger or dark hair, with blonde being rare. Um, Frankish has a even higher chance of brown hair, although and a decent chance of dark hair and smaller chances of blonde and ginger. Germans, again, mostly brown, with lesser chance of dark or blonde, and then smaller but not so small chance of ginger. And then if we look at Norse here, you can see there's a 70% chance of being blonde, with the ginger coming in a distant second, and then you have brown and dark hair. And that's actually different because if you look in Ruler Designer, um, how the Ruler Designer uses the Northern Ruler Designer as the template, which uses Caucasian, which here does set these hair colors differently. So interestingly enough, even though most of your Norse characters in game are almost always going to be blonde, this changes it up a bit with getting a lot of red hair. Oh, I think that was because we were starting on a character that the um had the hidden ethnicity chosen already. But anyway, if we select the northern ethnicity here, there are large chances of brown or dark hair. But actually in game, because it's pulling from the specific, usually it's pulling from the specific blonde one, the majority of the characters are going to be blonde. So then if we look at the Mediterranean ethnicity here, um, you can see it uses the ethnicity template, um, but then it defines the skin color as slightly darker, more just tanner than the Western Central or Northern one. It changes the eye color, making brown eyes much more common. And then it changes the hair color, making there about a 2/3 chance of black hair, a third brown, and 2% chance of blonde hair. Then it defines the complexion, the eyebrow shapes, fullness, and the hair type. Um, but other than that, the facial structure is also going to be identical um, to the central, western, and the northern. So again, if we generate a bunch of these, you can see that the hair is generally darker. They have darker skin, but the facial structure is still about equal to the eh, northern and western central. So if we look at Slavic, it's based on the ethnicity template, um, but it does change a couple things, whereas the Western Central, the Northern, and the Mediterranean didn't change any. This changes a bit of the facial structure in terms of like chin, eyes, jaw, head, forehead, mouth, ears, nose, etc. And then it does go ahead and define the separate hair colors like the Western does with blonde, ginger, brown, and dark hair. But because it's changed a couple things, in comparison to the total amount of genes, it's not that much. But if you look at the facial structure, they you can notice a bit of a difference compared to the like northern and western European. And then if you look through some of the other ones, like as examples, African, which is West African, changes stuff about the eyes, the forehead, head shape, mouth, and nose. But it generally leaves the chin, jaw, neck, cheek, and ear the same as the default. Um, so you can see these have a bit changed than like Slavic does. For example, this is 577 lines for Slavic. This is 686 more for African. And then Asian also has differences, actually a bit more, getting up to 896 for Asian. But then again, that is also kind of the base, and since All Under Heaven, they've split that up into a couple sub ethnicities like Chinese or Mongol. Not again, and this isn't as long, but this is just defining what's different among Chinese from the base Asian. So, as an example for how things look like, here's a custom ethnicity I put together. Essentially, I just copied like the eye genes from the Asian ethnicity and then like the nose and mouth genes from the African ethnicity and left the rest of them as default. So, you can kind of tell that, got the different aspects. Been combined into a single ethnicity there. Uh, but again, like a couple things, like I've left the eye color um, as the Caucasian default, the hair color the same. I set the using as Mongol, which is why Mongol hairstyles and beards are showing up. But again, that's it's elements that would appear in game, not typically that would appear on altogether on randomly generated characters, but that's how you make a basic custom ethnicity. So, notably, in After the End, which is set in the post-apocalyptic Americas, um, you have a bit more of variety in race with the New World. So they do use the default ethnicities for white, black, and Asian characters, but they have created a number of custom New World ethnicities for various Native American groups. So, as an example of a couple of the new indigenous ones, you have Maya here, you have Uto Aztecan, uh, you've got Amerindian refers to most like Plains Native American, got Patagonian, so pretty wide variety there. They've also added a couple of like biracial or multiracial ethnicities. Because in regular Crusader Kings, it wouldn't, characters can mix, but whenever it generates its new characters, it'll go for a standard ethnicity. But if you add these, then the game can generate a couple people with a multiracial background, um, in varying percentages depending on how common it would be in that culture. So then there's also a mod called Age of the Fifth Sun, which is set in pre-Columbian Mexico and Central America. And this also it seems to use the uh, ethnicity, some of the indigenous American ethnicities from after the end. Because if you compare the files here, they seem to be identical. Um, so these seem to be pretty good ethnicity files for Central Americans. So then there's the ethnicities and portraits expanded mod, which adds actually thousands of ethnicities here. Um, but what this does is it adds dozens of ethnicity types, and each of those types generally has dozens of ethnicities within itself. It doesn't have it for every culture, but it does like distinguish between French and German, Irish, Iberian, Greek, Italian, English, etc. And each of these will have dozens. But so like you've got multiple German cultures like Bavarian, Saxon, Franconian, Swabian. But again, and they'll pull from the same ones, but again, it will be distinct from the others. So we have, various Germans, we have the French, uh, Hungarians, Armenians, all that. And you can see that actually the way that these are defined is that there's less, like as compared to one of the old ones where there was more of a range and different chances of happening all within that. The ranges here are a lot smaller for each individual ethnicity. Um, so everybody within that one ethnicity will look more similar, even though there is a bit of room of variety to see. But again, with each ethnicity or with each culture having access to all of these, there's a you have a chance of it getting any of these. So it'll there's enough options that it'll keep it varied for when new characters appear, and then as characters are in the game already, and then have kids that'll mix it up between what's already been established to different ones that actually look specifically like different people who more closely resemble someone from that culture. Um, so yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, there are mods that add non-human races, like how we looked at Elder Kings. Again, that's mostly be a bit beyond the scope of this video because it involves editing the models and textures. You can take this knowledge and go ahead and apply it to what's in there already by looking at that. But then, there is a lot of stuff available out there right now. Um, again, we how after the end, if you want to have ethnicities that aren't present in Europe or Eurasia, Africa, after the end has some good ones there. If you want to get a bit more specific on differentiating between different types of people in the old world, ethnicities, and Portraits Expanded does a lot of that. Um, but yeah, so that's the main process of creating your own ethnicity. So then I guess there's one final thing. If we look back at the Greek ethnicity that I created, um, if you actually look at these, I assigned the weights here from 0 to 0.19 to 1. These are all 0. It was You could just delete them, but I kept them in anyway because I sent it through. I automated it to make it easier and place. But anyway, you can see for each of these, I have the weight um, to be within one of the maximums for pretty much everything. And is that in here you can see whatever happens sends it all to 1. So, you know. So that's, yeah, again, that's basically how it all works. Uh, if you've got questions, um, feel free to comment. And or if you think I got something wrong, let me know. One thing I forgot to mention is that if you do want to base something as a submod to another mod, um, be sure to use in your load order. Be sure to add your mod later. Um, but yeah, so that's most of that. I think after this, I'm gonna make one about how to tutorial about how to define the different uh like the how to define the graphical culture with what the like how the hairstyles and beards and clothing. But yeah, so hope this was helpful and see ya.